November 16, 1957. Plainfield, Wisconsin. Deputy Sheriff Frank Worden walks into his mother's hardware store and finds blood on the floor. The cash register is open. His mother, Bernice, is gone. The last receipt shows an anti-freeze sale to a local handyman named Ed Gein. What investigators found at Gein's farmhouse that night didn't just shock a small Wisconsin town. It fundamentally changed how the FBI hunts serial killers. Skull bowls, furniture upholstered with human skin, 9 masks made from real human faces, a suit constructed entirely from women's flesh. But here's what most people don't realize. Ed Gein's case didn't just inspire horror movies. It became the foundation for modern criminal profiling, teaching investigators 4 psychological patterns they still use today to catch killers before they strike again. Here's what Ed Gein's case taught us about serial killers. If you watched our previous deep dive into Ed Gein's childhood, how his mother Augusta shaped his psychology over nearly 4 decades, you already understand what created this killer. But today, we're covering something different. Something that matters beyond one disturbed man in rural Wisconsin. Before we dive into this tragic story, I want to ask you to take a few important actions that genuinely help this mission. First, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Every single share helps this investigation reach more people who might recognize warning signs in the real world and protect a child before it's too late. In the comments, tell me your city and what time you're watching. This helps me understand when to release these investigations so they reach as many people as possible. And so, these hard-earned lessons about abuse and danger don't get buried by the algorithm. My channel exists to tell the stories of children and vulnerable people who needed protection and didn't get it. Each investigation is more than a tragedy. It's a training tool. It's a way for us to learn how to recognize grooming, coercion, escalating violence, and systems that fail the most vulnerable. If you want to go a step further in supporting this work, you can use Super Thanks or become a channel member. Your support there directly funds the research, court document requests, and long-form investigations that bigger platforms often ignore. I've also created a new book series, What Netflix Didn't Show You, starting with How Ed Gein's Mother Created a Monster. Everyone asks, what made Ed Gein this way? This book answers that question by examining the religious trauma and psychological conditioning that helped create a killer. It's valued at $24.99, but this is not a traditional sale. It's a way to support the channel's mission. Click the link below to download your copy, in whatever amount you feel is right, as a way of supporting this work and helping me continue bringing you these in-depth investigations. And when you finish this video, be sure to watch the other cases on the channel. Understanding patterns of abuse and violence today might help you notice warning signs tomorrow, and could be the difference in protecting a child or vulnerable person who's in danger. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your support. Now, let's begin. We're examining how Ed Gein's case revolutionized FBI criminal profiling. In the 1970s, FBI agent John Douglas was working out of the Milwaukee field office when he first learned about the Gein case. Using his FBI credentials, Douglas gained access to evidence that had been sealed since the 1950s, crime scene photographs locked away in wax-sealed envelopes for nearly 2 decades. Douglas later wrote that Gein was so far gone into their own mental illness that direct interviews yielded limited information. But the case itself, the psychological autopsy of what created Ed Gein, that became foundational to everything the FBI's behavioral science unit would build. Between 1976 and 1979, Douglas and fellow agent Robert Ressler interviewed 36 convicted serial killers. They were searching for patterns, psychological signatures that could help investigators identify and catch predators faster. Ed Gein's case kept appearing in their research, not because of what he did, but because of why he did it. Today, we're breaking down 4 specific patterns from Ed Gein's case that changed criminal profiling forever. Pattern 1. The maternal domination pipeline. How controlling mothers create specific types of killers. Pattern 2. Isolation as an amplifier. How social withdrawal removes every barrier that might stop a developing predator. Pattern 3. The disorganized killer classification. How Gein's chaotic crimes force the FBI to rethink their assumptions about serial murderers. Pattern 4. Identity assumption through necrophilia. How Gein's woman suit taught investigators that some crimes aren't about what they appear to be. Each of these patterns has been used to catch killers you've heard of, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how. Let's start with Pattern 1. To understand how Ed Gein's case revolutionized criminal profiling, we need to examine what psychiatrists discovered when they finally got inside his mind. On November 23, 1957, 1 week after his arrest, Ed Gein was admitted to Central State Hospital for a 30-day, court-ordered psychiatric observation. The medical team had one question: how does a quiet, unremarkable handyman become capable of crimes that seasoned investigators couldn't even process? The answer wasn't in Ed's brain chemistry. It was in his childhood. Dr. Edward F. Schubert, the superintendent of Central State Hospital, led Gein's psychiatric evaluation. His findings were detailed in the official assessment summary, and I want to read you the key conclusion directly. There is ample reason to believe that his violation of the graves was in response to the demands of his fantasy life, which was motivated by his abnormally magnified attachment to his mother. Abnormally magnified attachment. That clinical phrase describes 39 years of psychological torture that Augusta Gein inflicted on her son. Let me show you exactly what that looked like. Augusta Gein didn't just raise her son with strict religious beliefs. She systematically destroyed his ability to develop as an independent human being through 3 specific mechanisms that psychiatrists documented. First, religious weaponization. Every morning and every evening, Augusta forced Ed to sit through Bible readings. But these weren't readings about love, forgiveness, or redemption. She read exclusively about damnation, about sexual sin, about prostitutes and immoral women. She made Ed read passages from Proverbs about the strange woman whose house is the way to hell. She made him read from Revelation about the whore of Babylon, and after each reading she would tell Ed directly, "Women will destroy you. All women are evil. They will drag you to hell." Not once, not occasionally, every single day for decades. Second, complete social isolation. In 1914, when Ed was 8 years old, Augusta moved the family to a remote 160-acre farm outside Plainfield, Wisconsin. The farmhouse was miles from the nearest neighbor, miles from town, miles from any other human contact. Augusta forbade all social interaction. No friends, no playdates, no school clubs, no sports. When other parents invited Ed to birthday parties, Augusta refused. When teachers asked why Ed couldn't participate in school events, she claimed he had farm work. The psychiatric evaluation from 1957 noted that Gein had been withdrawn, limited in his contacts over a period of years, and failed to develop emotionally in a normal manner. That's an understatement. Ed Gein had no frame of reference for normal human relationships. His mother was his entire social world. Third, psychological enmeshment. This is where Augusta's abuse becomes most disturbing and most relevant to understanding the pattern FBI profilers would later identify. Augusta refused to let Ed develop any identity separate from her. She made him sleep in her bedroom, not nearby, not in the next room, in her bedroom. And this continued into his teenage years, into his 20s, into his 30s. Ed never had privacy. He never had independence. He never had a single moment where he existed as a separate person from his mother. Psychologists call this enmeshment, when a parent refuses to allow a child to develop their own identity. The child becomes an extension of the parent. Their thoughts become the parent's thoughts. Their beliefs become the parent's beliefs. This distinction would prove critical in 3 major investigations that followed. Cases where recognizing the identity assumption pattern led to breakthroughs investigators might otherwise have missed. The psychiatric team at Central State Hospital documented the result. At 51 years old, Ed Gein had the emotional maturity of a young child. He couldn't understand complex emotions. He couldn't process normal social interactions. He couldn't function independently. Modern forensic psychiatrist Professor Paul E. Mullen, reviewing the case in 2025, noted something crucial. He heard his mother's voice after her death, a common experience in bereavement rather than a symptom of psychosis. His mother had a profound and enduring influence, instilling a fear of the sinful outside world and particularly of women. This is the critical insight. Augusta's voice didn't stop when she died in 1945. Her beliefs didn't disappear. They intensified. After Augusta's death, Ed sealed off her bedroom completely. He sealed off the living room where she used to read the Bible to him. Her clothes stayed in the closet. Her books stayed on the shelves. Her reading glasses stayed on the side table. Nothing was moved. Nothing was touched. These rooms became shrines. And in Ed's mind, Augusta was still there, still watching, still judging, still controlling. But preserving her rooms wasn't enough. Ed needed his mother back. In 1947, about 2 years after her death, Ed went to a local cemetery at night. He dug up a grave, the grave of a middle-aged woman who had recently been buried. A woman who looked like Augusta. This began a pattern that would continue for years. Between 1947 and 1954, Ed robbed multiple graves. Always women. Always middle-aged. Always resembling his mother. And what did he do with these bodies? He created what psychologists later called a woman suit. He was literally trying to become his mother. Every victim Ed chose, every grave he robbed, every piece of human skin he preserved. They all had one thing in common. They looked like Augusta, Mary Hogan, Bernice Worden, the women from the cemeteries, all middle-aged, all bearing resemblance to his mother. Ed wasn't killing random women. He was trying to recreate Augusta. He was trying to bring her back. He was trying to become her. This is the pattern that would change criminal profiling forever. In the 1970s, FBI agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler began a project that would revolutionize law enforcement. Between 1976 and 1979, they conducted in-depth interviews with 36 convicted serial killers and violent predators. They weren't just collecting stories, they were searching for psychological patterns, common threads that could help investigators identify and catch future killers. And one pattern kept emerging. John Douglas later described it this way. It seemed to always be the mother thing with these guys. They love the mother, they want the mother's love, but at the same time, they hate the mother. Douglas noted that in his interviews with serial killers when they reached the topic of their mothers, the most hardened criminals would start breaking down. This wasn't coincidence. It was a pattern. Robert Ressler, Douglas's partner in developing the FBI's behavioral science methodology, explained why they needed new terminology. We needed terminology that was not based on psychiatric jargon to define the different types of offenders and for police and other law enforcement officers to understand. The clinical terms, enmeshment, anxious ambivalent attachment, psychosexual fixation, weren't useful for detectives trying to catch killers. They needed practical categories. So Ressler and Douglas created them. One of the patterns they identified became known informally as the maternal annihilation complex. This describes killers whose crimes are driven by unresolved rage toward domineering or abusive mothers, rage that gets displaced onto women who represent or resemble the mother figure. The key characteristics they documented: 1. An enmeshed, controlling mother who prevented normal psychological development. 2. The killer's inability to form healthy relationships with women outside the mother-son dynamic. 3. Victim selection based on resemblance to the mother, in age, appearance, or social characteristics. 4. Crime scenes that show evidence of control, possession, or symbolic transformation rather than purely sexual motivation. Ed Gein fit every single criterion. When Douglas used his FBI credentials to access the Gein case files in the 1970s, he examined crime scene photographs that had been sealed in wax envelopes since 1957. What he found confirmed the pattern. Gein's crimes weren't random acts of violence. They were systematic attempts to recreate and possess his mother. The woman suit wasn't about sexual deviance, it was about identity assumption. Ed was trying to literally become Augusta because he couldn't exist without her. Douglas later wrote that interviewing Gein directly yielded limited information because Gein was so far gone into their own mental illness. But the case study itself became foundational to FBI profiling methodology. This pattern recognition didn't stay theoretical. It became integrated into the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, the database system that helps investigators connect crimes across jurisdictions. When a new case shows evidence of maternal fixation violence, victim selection matching mother's characteristics, crime scenes showing symbolic transformation rather than typical sexual assault patterns, evidence of collecting or preserving victim remains, investigators can now reference similar cases and identify likely offender profiles. Before Gein, investigators assumed serial killers were calculating predators motivated by sexual sadism. Gein proved that severe psychological damage, specifically maternal enmeshment and control, could create an entirely different type of killer. One whose crimes look random but actually follow a precise psychological logic. This brings us to the critical question: was Ed Gein unique, or was his case revealing a pattern that investigators had been missing? The answer came from the FBI's interview project, and it changed everything. Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer. Between 1972 and 1973, Kemper murdered 8 people in California, including 6 young women he picked up as hitchhikers. He stood 6 feet 9 inches tall, weighed 300 pounds, and had an IQ of 145, genius level. When John Douglas interviewed Kemper, he encountered one of the most articulate and self-aware killers in FBI history, and Kemper explained exactly why he killed. Kemper's mother, Clarnell Strandberg, was described in case files as a neurotic, domineering alcoholic. She frequently belittled and humiliated her son despite his obvious intelligence. She made him sleep in the basement as punishment. She told him, according to Kemper's testimony, that nobody's going to want him, that he was no good. Sound familiar? John Douglas documented the parallel directly. Even though he was a big guy, his mother just demeaned him, degraded him, broke him down as a kid, so when he went to school, being as big as he was the one being bullied. Douglas continued, "He's a result of this abusive early childhood by his mother." But here's where Kemper's case illuminated the pattern in a way Gein's couldn't. Because Kemper could articulate his psychology clearly. When asked why he targeted young college women, Kemper gave investigators the answer. There's a lot that leads into that happening, but that's what happened. They represented not what my mother was, but what she liked, what she coveted, what was important to her, and I was destroying it. Kemper's mother worked at a university. She constantly compared Edmund unfavorably to the college students she encountered. So Kemper killed college students, destroying what his mother valued, what she said he could never have. The maternal pattern became undeniable on April 20, 1973. That night, Kemper bludgeoned his mother to death with a claw hammer. He decapitated her. He placed her head on the mantelpiece, and then he screamed at it for hours. Forensic psychology professor Louis Schlesinger analyzed what happened next. He turned himself in right after he killed his mother because he then solved this problem. He didn't have to kill symbolically anymore. The moment Kemper killed his actual mother, the psychological pressure driving him to kill mother surrogates released. The pattern was complete. Now compare this to Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. Rader murdered 10 people in Kansas between 1974 and 91. He was a compliance officer, a church president, a Boy Scout leader. He had a wife and 2 children. He appeared completely normal. Forensic psychologist Dr. Catherine Ramsland, who conducted extensive interviews with Rader, noted something crucial about his background. Rader had a very normal, benign family upbringing, and his parents were well respected by their community and church. No domineering mother, no overt abuse, no enmeshment. So, how does Rader fit the pattern? Dr. Ramsland documented a formative incident from Rader's childhood, what investigators now call the couch spring incident. When Rader was young, his mother's ring got caught on a couch spring, leaving her temporarily trapped and helpless. She told Dennis to go get help. Dr. Ramsland explained what happened next. She apparently was terrified and told him to go get help, and he felt the first stirrings of arousal over this. It was exciting to him to see a woman helpless, and it was the beginning of his ideas about women that what he wanted from them was to keep them trapped and helpless and looking to him in terror. Rader's case shows the pattern operating differently. His mother wasn't controlling, she was emotionally distant. But the psychological impact on his development was similar. A distorted understanding of women, control, and power that became imprinted during a critical developmental moment. The common thread isn't a specific type of mother. It's the disruption of normal psychological development regarding women and control, disruption that creates a template the killer spends his life trying to fulfill. For Gein, that template was becoming his mother. For Kemper, it was destroying what his mother valued. For Rader, it was recreating that moment of female helplessness. This is what Ed Gein's case taught investigators about the maternal domination pattern. 1. The mother-son relationship in these cases isn't just dysfunctional, it's formative. It creates the psychological template that shapes all future violence. 2. Victim selection is never random. These killers choose victims who match their internal template, even when they can't consciously articulate why. 3. The crimes aren't primarily about sex. They're about control, identity, and psychological completion. Understanding this changes how investigators read crime scenes. 4. Early intervention matters. Every one of these cases showed warning signs years before the first murder. The patterns were visible, if anyone had known what to look for. Ed Gein didn't choose to become what he became. Augusta spent 39 years building a psychological prison, one that Ed would never escape. But his case gave investigators the tools to recognize this pattern in others, to identify the warning signs, to catch killers before they complete their psychological mission. That's what Pattern 1 taught us. But the maternal domination pipeline was just the beginning. The FBI's study of Gein's case revealed 3 more patterns that would reshape criminal profiling. Pattern 2 examined something even more disturbing: how social isolation removes every barrier that might stop a developing predator. December 29, 1945. Augusta. Gein took her last breath in that isolated farmhouse outside Plainfield, Wisconsin. Her son Ed, 39 years old, watched the only person who had ever defined his existence slip away. And in that moment, something broke. Not just grief, something structural, something that would take 12 years to fully collapse, 12 years during which Ed Gein would deteriorate from a grieving son into something investigators had never encountered. What happened between 1945 and 1957 is a case study in how isolation amplifies mental illness. How the absence of human connection removes every check, every reality test, every opportunity for intervention that might stop a person's descent into psychosis. The psychiatric evaluation conducted at Central State Hospital in December 1957 documented the result. Dr. Edward F. Schubert, the hospital superintendent, led the assessment team. Their diagnosis, schizophrenic reaction of the chronic undifferentiated type, ongoing for an undetermined number of years. But here's what the evaluation also noted. Gein had been withdrawn, limited in his contacts over a period of years, and failed to develop emotionally in a normal manner. Limited in his contacts. That clinical phrase conceals a devastating reality. After Augusta died, Ed Gein had essentially no meaningful human interaction for over a decade. Let me walk you through the timeline of Ed's deterioration, because it shows exactly how isolation transformed grief into psychosis, and psychosis into murder. 1945. Augusta dies. Ed seals off her bedroom and the living room where she used to read the Bible to him. Everything stays exactly as she left it. Her clothes in the closet, her books on the shelves, her reading glasses on the side table. Ed begins living in the remaining small spaces of the farmhouse, the kitchen, one small bedroom. The rest belongs to his mother's memory. 1947. 2 years after Augusta's death, Ed goes to a local cemetery at night. He digs up a grave, a middle-aged woman who had recently been buried, a woman who resembles his mother. He brings the body back to his farmhouse. This is the first documented evidence of Ed's psychotic break manifesting in action. His fantasy life, his need to resurrect Augusta, has crossed into the physical world, and no one knows. 1947, 1954. For 7 years, Ed continues robbing graves. Always women, always middle-aged, always resembling Augusta. He creates face masks from their skin. He fashions skull bowls. He constructs what psychiatrists would later call a woman suit, a vest with breasts, leggings made from human flesh. He's trying to become his mother, and during all of this, 7 years of grave robbery, 7 years of psychological deterioration, 7 years of constructing human artifacts in his farmhouse, not a single person intervenes. Why? Because Ed Gein lived in almost complete isolation. The farmhouse was miles from town. He had no friends, no family checking on him, no social connections that might have noticed something was wrong. December 8, 1954. Ed walks into a tavern in Pine Grove, Wisconsin. The owner is Mary Hogan, a 51-year-old woman who bears a resemblance to Augusta. Ed shoots her, takes her body back to his farmhouse. This is the transition point. The bodies from the cemetery weren't enough anymore. Maybe they were too decomposed. Maybe the psychological need had intensified. Maybe the line between dead women and living women had blurred entirely in Ed's fractured mind. Whatever the reason, grave robbery escalated to murder. And still, no one intervened. November 16, 1957. Ed walks into Worden's hardware store in Plainfield. Bernice Worden is 58 years old. She looks like Augusta. Ed shoots her with a rifle from her own store. Loads her body into his truck, takes her back to his farmhouse. This time, he's caught. 12 years. 12 years from Augusta's death to Ed's arrest. 12 years of unchecked deterioration. 12 years during which severe mental illness progressed without a single intervention, without a single reality check, without a single human connection that might have altered the trajectory. Dr. Schubert's psychiatric evaluation identified what had happened. His assessment concluded that Gein's crimes were in response to the demands of his fantasy life, which was motivated by his abnormally magnified attachment to his mother. The evaluation also noted that Gein may have hallucinated on some occasions, hearing his mother's voice, seeing things that weren't there. But here's the critical insight. Ed's schizophrenia didn't emerge from nowhere. It developed over 12 years of total isolation, 12 years in which his only companion was Augusta's memory, 12 years in which no one could tell him that his beliefs were delusional, his actions were wrong, his reality was fractured. Isolation didn't create Ed Gein's mental illness, but it removed every barrier that might have stopped its most horrific manifestations. When FBI agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas began studying serial killers in the late 1970s, they noticed something that case files alone couldn't explain. Many of these killers had documented mental health issues, symptoms that appeared years before their first crimes. But the symptoms went untreated. The warning signs went unnoticed. The deterioration continued unchecked. Why? Isolation. John Douglas, reflecting on cases like GEIN'S, noted a principle that would become foundational to FBI profiling methodology. Isolation doesn't create killers, but it removes every barrier that might stop them. This insight changed how investigators understood the relationship between mental illness and violence. Mental health issues alone don't predict homicidal behavior. The vast majority of people with schizophrenia, depression, or other disorders never harm anyone. But when severe mental illness develops in complete social isolation, when there's no family checking in, no friends noticing changes, no colleagues observing behavior, no community providing accountability, the risk calculus shifts dramatically. Robert Ressler, Douglas's partner in developing the FBI's behavioral science methodology, explained why this pattern mattered for investigators. We needed terminology that was not based on psychiatric jargon to define the different types of offenders and for police and other law enforcement officers to understand. The clinical terms weren't useful for detectives trying to catch killers or assess risk. What investigators needed was practical recognition. Isolation functions as an accelerant. It doesn't cause the fire, but it removes every firebreak that might contain it. This recognition became integrated into VICAP, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, the FBI's database system for tracking and connecting violent crimes across jurisdictions. When assessing potential suspects, investigators now consider isolation as a key risk factor. Not just, does this person live alone, but a more comprehensive assessment. Does the individual have meaningful social connections? Is there anyone in regular contact who might notice behavioral changes? Has there been recent social withdrawal or loss of relationships? Are there barriers, family, friends, colleagues, community, that might provide intervention opportunities? Ed Gein's case demonstrated what happens when the answer to all these questions is no. The Gein case taught investigators something else. The window for intervention can be measured in years. Ed's deterioration didn't happen overnight. Between Augusta's death in 1945 and his first murder in 1954, 9 years passed. 9 years during which his mental illness was developing, his grip on reality was loosening, his fantasy life was demanding increasingly concrete fulfillment. Any intervention during those 9 years might have altered the outcome. A neighbor who noticed something wrong, a family member who checked in, a community connection that provided reality testing. But the isolation was complete, and so the deterioration was unchecked. This pattern, isolation as the accelerant that transforms mental illness into violence, would prove relevant far beyond Ed Gein's case. Let me show you 3 modern investigations where recognizing this pattern led to critical breakthroughs. Between 1978 and 91, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 17 men and boys. His crimes included necrophilia, dismemberment, and cannibalism. When police finally entered his Milwaukee apartment, they found human remains stored throughout: skulls in the closet, photographs of dismembered bodies, a human heart in the freezer. But here's what the investigation revealed about the years preceding his capture. Dahmer lived in almost complete social isolation. He had no close friends. His family contact was minimal. His father later wrote that Jeffrey drifted away after the parents' divorce in 1978. He worked night shifts at a chocolate factory, further reducing social interaction. His Milwaukee apartment became a self-contained world, a world in which his mental illness could progress without observation, without intervention, without reality checks. The pattern investigators recognized: an isolated individual with documented mental health issues and substance abuse, living without social accountability, experiencing escalating violence over 13 years. Here's the specific investigative insight that emerged from the Dahmer case. Neighbors had complained about strange smells from his apartment. Police had actually encountered Dahmer with one of his victims, a 14-year-old boy who had escaped, naked and bleeding. But because Dahmer appeared normal in brief interactions, calm, articulate, cooperative, these warning signs were dismissed. The isolation pattern teaches investigators that surface-level normalcy during brief encounters doesn't indicate actual psychological stability. Dahmer could present as functional for minutes at a time, but sustained social contact, the kind that might have revealed his deterioration, didn't exist. For 25 years, Ted Kaczynski lived alone in a cabin in rural Montana. No electricity, no running water, no telephone. His only connection to the outside world, the bombs he mailed to universities and airlines, killing 3 people and injuring 23. The FBI spent 17 years trying to catch the Unabomber. The breakthrough came partly from recognizing the isolation pattern. Kaczynski's manifesto, the 35,000-word document he demanded newspapers publish, revealed the psychology of extreme isolation. The FBI's linguistic analysis showed someone who had substituted ideology for human connection, someone whose worldview had developed without any social feedback or reality testing. The pattern recognition helped narrow the suspect pool. Investigators looked for someone with technical expertise and academic background, but also someone living in extreme isolation, whose ideological development could proceed unchecked for years. Kaczynski's brother David recognized the manifesto's ideas as similar to letters Ted had written. That family connection, attenuated as it was, ultimately led to the arrest. The investigative insight. Prolonged isolation allows ideological systems to develop that would be challenged or moderated through normal social interaction. Kaczynski's anti-technology philosophy grew increasingly extreme because no one was there to question it. This pattern now informs how investigators assess domestic terrorism risks, recognizing that isolated individuals with grievance-based ideologies present different intervention opportunities than socially connected individuals. Eileen Wuornos murdered 7 men in Florida between late 1989 and late 90. Her case challenged assumptions about serial killer profiles. She was female, her victims were men. Her method was shooting rather than the more personal violence typical of male serial killers. But the isolation pattern was unmistakable. Wuornos had experienced severe childhood trauma and abuse. She became homeless as a teenager. Her adult life was marked by transience, sex work, and complete absence of stable social connections. When investigators analyzed her case, they recognized how isolation had removed what they called moral guardrails, the social connections and community ties that provide accountability and intervention opportunities. Wuornos had no family checking on her, no friends providing reality testing, no community offering support or noticing warning signs. Her mental health deteriorated without any intervention opportunity. The investigative insight from Wuornos's case, the isolation pattern applies across gender. Female serial killers were previously considered so rare that profiling methodologies hadn't adequately addressed them. Wuornos's case demonstrated that the isolation to violence trajectory operated regardless of gender when trauma, mental illness, and complete social abandonment converged. What these 3 cases share with Ed Gein is the pattern FBI investigators learned to recognize. Isolation functions as the environment in which mental illness can progress to violence without intervention. Dahmer's Milwaukee apartment, Kaczynski's Montana cabin, Warnos's transient homelessness, GEIN'S remote farmhouse. Different settings, different psychologies, different crimes. But the same underlying pattern. When human connection disappears, so does every opportunity to interrupt the trajectory toward violence. Ed Gein's 12 years of isolation between 1945 and 1957 became a template for understanding how social disconnection amplifies risk. Not because isolation causes violence, but because it removes every barrier that might prevent it. This is what Pattern 2 taught investigators about serial killers. But isolation wasn't the only pattern the FBI discovered in Gein's case. His crimes revealed something else, something that forced investigators to completely rethink their assumptions about how serial killers operate. Pattern 3 examines the disorganized killer classification and why Ed Gein's chaotic crime scenes changed criminal profiling forever. November 16, 1957. 9:47 p.m. Waushara County. Sheriff's deputies arrived at Ed Gein's farmhouse expecting to find evidence of a missing woman. What they encountered instead would force law enforcement to fundamentally rethink everything they believed about serial killers. Deputy Sheriff Frank Worden led the search. His mother Bernice was the missing woman, last seen that morning selling antifreeze to Ed Gein. What deputies documented that night in their official reports reads like an inventory of madness. Let me walk you through exactly what investigators found, because the chaos of this crime scene became foundational to FBI profiling methodology. In the wooden shed behind the farmhouse, Bernice Worden's body, headless and gutted, hanging upside down from the rafters. Her torso had been dressed out like a deer carcass, the work of someone who'd done this before. Her head was found in a burlap sack near the property. Her heart sat in a plastic bag beside the kitchen stove. But Bernice Worden wasn't the only victim present at that farmhouse. Inside the main structure, investigators documented 10 female skulls, some with the tops sawn off, converted into bowls, 9 masks constructed from real human faces, chair seats upholstered with human skin, a lampshade frame stretched with human flesh, a belt fashioned from human nipples, a wastebasket made of skin, organs preserved in paper bags, and in one of those bags, the head of Mary Hogan, the tavern owner who had disappeared 3 years earlier. Then, investigators found the woman's suit, a vest constructed with breasts attached, leggings made from human skin, face masks that could be worn. This wasn't a collection. It was a wardrobe. Ed Gein had been wearing these remains, transforming himself into the women he'd taken. The forensic team eventually connected Gein to approximately 40 grave robberies between 1947 and 1952. All middle-aged women, all exhumed from local cemeteries. Here's what investigators couldn't understand in 1957. None of this followed any pattern they recognized. There was no victim selection strategy. Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden weren't targeted through careful planning. They were simply available. Women who happened to remind Gein of his mother, encountered through random circumstance. There was no attempt to conceal evidence. The farmhouse was a museum of his crimes, preserved in plain sight for anyone who entered. There was no escalating methodology. The grave robberies and murders weren't calculated. They were compulsive responses to psychotic episodes, driven by a schizophrenic mind trying to resurrect his dead mother. The psychiatric evaluation conducted at Central State Hospital confirmed what the crime scene suggested. Dr. Edward F. Schubert's team diagnosed Gein with schizophrenic reaction of the chronic undifferentiated type, ongoing for an undetermined number of years. This wasn't a calculating predator. This was severe mental illness manifesting as serial violence. And in 1957, investigators had no framework for understanding that distinction. They were about to create one. Before Ed Gein, law enforcement operated under a fundamental assumption about serial killers. They were criminal masterminds. The popular conception, reinforced by fiction and early criminology, portrayed serial murderers as calculating predators. Intelligent, methodical, always 3 steps ahead of investigators. Evil geniuses who selected victims carefully and covered their tracks with precision. Ed Gein shattered that assumption. In the late 1970s, FBI agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas began developing what would become the Behavioral Science Unit's profiling methodology. Between 1976 and 1979, they interviewed 36 convicted serial killers, searching for patterns that could help investigators identify and apprehend future offenders. The Ed Gein case kept appearing in their research, not as an outlier, but as a template for an entire category of killer that existing frameworks couldn't explain. Robert Ressler later explained why they needed new terminology. We needed terminology that was not based on psychiatric jargon to define the different types of offenders and for police and other law enforcement officers to understand. Instead of saying that one crime scene showed evidence of a psychopathic personality, we started telling the officer that the crime scene was organized, and so was the possible offender, while in another the perpetrator might be disorganized, when some mental disorder, schizophrenia or psychosis, was present. This was revolutionary. Ressler and Douglas weren't just creating vocabulary, they were creating an entirely new investigative framework. The organized versus disorganized classification system emerged directly from cases like Ed Gein''s. An organized offender displays characteristics that suggest planning and control. High intelligence, social competence, targeted victim selection, crime scenes that show evidence of restraint and concealment, bodies transported away from kill sites, weapons brought to and removed from scenes. A disorganized offender displays the opposite pattern, and Ed Gein became the textbook example. The FBI documented the disorganized offender profile based on cases like Gein''s, below average to average intelligence. Gein''s IQ tested at 99, precisely average. Originates from a turbulent family situation. Augusta's psychological torture qualified. Socially inadequate and isolated, Gein had no meaningful relationships outside his mother. Lives alone or with a parent. Gein lived with Augusta until her death, then alone. Poor work history. Gein did odd jobs, never sustained employment. Crime scene is chaotic and messy. The farmhouse was a testament to chaos. No set plan of action. Crimes driven by impulse, not strategy. Victim is known or lives nearby. Both Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden were local. Body left at crime scene. Gein made no attempt to dispose of evidence. History of mental illness. Diagnosed schizophrenia. Engages in post-mortem acts. The woman suit. The skull bowls. The face masks. FBI documentation on the disorganized classification explicitly cites Gein''s case. Ed Gein, for example, exhumed the corpses of women that reminded him of his mother. He also consumed parts of them because he believed that he could preserve his mother's soul inside of his own body. He then created a female suit made of human flesh that he would wear when assuming his mother's identity. This wasn't the behavior of a criminal mastermind. This was psychosis expressing itself through violence. The organized, disorganized framework became foundational to the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, the database system that helps investigators connect crimes across jurisdictions. When a new case enters the system, one of the first classifications applied is organized versus disorganized. This single determination shapes the entire investigative approach. For organized crime scenes, investigators look for someone who might blend into society, employed, possibly married, capable of sustained social interaction. For disorganized crime scenes, they look for someone with documented mental illness, social isolation, possible previous contact with psychiatric facilities. The insight that changed everything. Before Ed Gein, investigators assumed they were hunting evil geniuses. After Gein, they understood that severe mental illness, untreated schizophrenia, active psychosis, could drive serial violence. This completely changed where they looked for suspects, how they allocated resources, and what intervention strategies might prevent future crimes. Ed Gein taught investigators that some serial killers aren't hiding in plain sight through cunning. They're deteriorating in isolation, driven by delusions, leaving chaotic evidence of their fractured minds. In January 1978, 6 people were murdered in Sacramento, California within a single month. The crime scenes were unprecedented in their chaos, victims found with blood drained, organs removed, evidence scattered without apparent logic. Investigators initially assumed they were hunting a calculating predator, someone who'd planned these attacks and would be difficult to identify. Then they applied the organized-disorganized framework. The disorganized pattern was unmistakable. No victim selection strategy. Chase attacked whoever's door happened to be unlocked, believing locked doors meant he wasn't welcome. Crime scenes showed no attempt at concealment. Evidence of post-mortem consumption. Complete absence of planning. This wasn't a criminal mastermind. This was active psychosis. Investigators shifted their approach. Instead of looking for someone who could blend into normal society, they searched for individuals with documented severe mental illness. They contacted psychiatric facilities. They reviewed records of patients with violent delusions. Richard Chase was apprehended within weeks. He had a documented history of paranoid schizophrenia, including a previous hospitalization where he'd been found drinking rabbit blood. The disorganized classification led investigators directly to him. Without that framework, they might have spent months hunting the wrong profile. Edmund Kemper's case in 1973 revealed something the original organized/disorganized framework hadn't anticipated. Some killers display both patterns. Kemper showed organized characteristics, high intelligence, careful victim selection, methodical concealment of evidence for extended periods. But he also showed disorganized elements, the emotional outbursts during crimes, the inability to stop once he'd started killing, the eventual breakdown that led him to murder his mother and immediately surrender. FBI profilers, studying Kemper alongside Gein, refined their typology to include a mixed classification. Some offenders operate on a spectrum, displaying organized planning that deteriorates into disorganized behavior under stress. This refinement, learned partly from comparing Kemper's calculated methodology with Gein's chaotic compulsion, made the framework more useful for investigators encountering complex cases. The organized-disorganized classification now operates in the first 48 hours of any serial investigation. VICAP automatically flags disorganized crime scene patterns for cross-reference with mental health facility records, a direct legacy of the Gein case teaching investigators where to look for psychotic offenders. Resource allocation decisions depend on classification. Disorganized cases often resolve faster because suspects are less capable of sustained evasion. Organized cases require different investigative approaches: surveillance, behavioral analysis, patience. The insight Ed Gein's case provided. Serial violence doesn't require genius. It doesn't require planning. It can emerge from the chaos of severe mental illness, leaving crime scenes that tell investigators exactly what kind of mind they're hunting. Before Gein, that distinction didn't exist in criminal profiling. After Gein, it became foundational. But perhaps the most disturbing pattern investigators discovered in Ed Gein's case wasn't about how he killed. It was about why he preserved what he took. Pattern 4 examines something that changed how investigators interpret crime scene evidence entirely. Identity assumption through necrophilia. And what it revealed about Ed Gein is more unsettling than the crimes themselves. What I'm about to discuss requires careful consideration. This pattern involves disturbing material that investigators needed to understand in order to protect future victims. I'll handle it with the clinical precision it demands. When investigators cataloged the evidence from Ed Gein's farmhouse in November 1957, they made an assumption that would prove fundamentally wrong. They assumed Ed Gein was a necrophiliac, someone sexually attracted to corpses. The evidence seemed to support this. The exhumed bodies, the preserved skin, the intimate contact with human remains over more than a decade. But the psychiatric evaluation told a completely different story. Dr. Edward F. Schubert, superintendent of Central State Hospital, led the assessment team that examined Gein after his arrest. His conclusion, documented in the official psychiatric evaluation, identified something investigators had never encountered. There is ample reason to believe that his violation of the graves was in response to the demands of his fantasy life, which was motivated by his abnormally magnified attachment to his mother. Ed Gein wasn't sexually attracted to the bodies he collected. He was trying to become his mother. Let me walk you through the specific evidence that led psychiatrists to this conclusion, because it changed how investigators interpret crime scene evidence to this day. The woman's suit wasn't constructed for sexual gratification. It was constructed for transformation. Police evidence logs documented a vest with breasts attached, designed to be worn, leggings made from human skin, designed to cover his own legs, face masks that could be placed over his own face. Ed Gein would put on these items and physically transform himself into a female figure, into Augusta. The psychiatric team at Central State Hospital noted that Gein may have hallucinated on some occasions, hearing his mother's voice, experiencing her presence even 12 years after her death. Modern forensic psychiatrist Professor Paul E. Mullen, reviewing the case in 2025, provided crucial clarification. He heard his mother's voice after her death, a common experience in bereavement rather than a symptom of psychosis. His mother had a profound and enduring influence, instilling a fear of the sinful outside world and particularly of women. But for Gein, hearing Augusta's voice wasn't enough. He needed to become her. The psychological mechanism here is specific. Extreme maternal enmeshment combined with psychotic deterioration created what psychiatrists call identity diffusion, the inability to maintain boundaries between self and other. Augusta had never allowed Ed to develop a separate identity. For 39 years, he existed only as an extension of her. Her thoughts were his thoughts. Her beliefs were his beliefs. His entire sense of self was defined through her. When she died, Ed didn't just lose his mother. He lost his entire identity. The woman's suit was his attempt to restore it, by literally becoming the person he couldn't exist without. This is what made Gein's case different from typical necrophilia cases investigators had encountered. Sexual necrophilia involves attraction to deceased bodies as objects of gratification. The bodies are targets. What Gein was doing involved no sexual component, at least not in any traditional sense. Psychiatrists who evaluated him confirmed this. The bodies weren't targets. They were materials. Components in a project of psychological resurrection. Every woman he exhumed resembled Augusta. Every mask he created was an attempt to wear her face. Every piece of preserved skin was a step toward transformation into the only person who had ever defined his existence. Dr. Schubert's evaluation noted that Gein showed no signs of sexual sadism. His murders were quick, efficient, almost mechanical, as one assessment described them. He wasn't prolonging suffering. He wasn't deriving pleasure from violence. He was collecting what he needed to become his mother. This distinction between sexual motivation and identity motivation would fundamentally change how investigators interpret crime scene evidence involving preserved human remains. The psychiatric conclusion from Gein's evaluation identified something investigators had never systematically documented. Necrophilic behavior can be driven by identity needs rather than sexual needs. When Ed Gein put on that woman's suit, he wasn't satisfying a sexual compulsion. He was attempting to solve an existential crisis, the complete absence of self that Augusta's death had revealed. Understanding this distinction would prove critical for catching future killers. When FBI agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas began interviewing serial killers in the late 1970s, they encountered a problem with existing criminal classifications. The clinical literature treated necrophilia as a single category, sexual attraction to corpses. But cases like Ed Gein's didn't fit that framework. They needed new distinctions. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit developed what became an informal but critical classification: identity assumption versus sexual necrophilia. Sexual necrophilia involves the deceased body as an object of desire. The motivation is gratification. Identity assumption involves the deceased body as material for transformation. The motivation is becoming, or possessing, another person's identity. This distinction completely changed how investigators read crime scenes. When investigators found preserved body parts at a crime scene, the old assumption was immediate: sexual deviant. Hunt for someone with paraphilic disorders, documented sexual offenses, escalating pattern of sexual crimes. The new framework asked a different question: who is this person trying to become? If the answer pointed toward identity assumption rather than sexual motivation, the suspect profile shifted entirely. Different psychological history, different social presentation, different intervention points. John Douglas, reflecting on cases involving preserved remains, noted a key insight that emerged from studying cases like GEIN'S. It seemed to always be the mother thing with these guys. They love the mother, they want the mother's love, but at the same time, they hate the mother. The identity assumption pattern typically traced back to maternal relationships, disrupted attachment, enmeshment, or profound loss that left the perpetrator without stable self-definition. This pattern recognition became integrated into VICAP, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, as a separate behavioral indicator. When crime scenes showed evidence of body preservation, dismemberment without disposal, or creation of items from human remains, investigators now asked specific questions. Do the preserved elements suggest sexual focus or identity focus? Is there evidence of transformation behavior, wearing, displaying, incorporating remains into the perpetrator's living space? Does victim selection suggest a specific identity the perpetrator is trying to recreate or possess? The investigative applications were concrete. Different motivations meant different suspect pools. Sexual necrophilia pointed toward individuals with documented paraphilic histories, escalating patterns of sexual offense, possible employment providing access to bodies. Identity assumption pointed toward individuals with profound attachment disruptions, social isolation, documented maternal enmeshment, possible psychiatric history involving identity disturbance. Ed Gein's case taught investigators that the same crime scene evidence, preserved human remains, could indicate completely different psychological profiles depending on why the perpetrator was preserving them. This distinction would prove critical in 3 major investigations that followed. Cases where recognizing the identity assumption pattern led to breakthroughs investigators might otherwise have missed. Between 1978 and 91, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 17 men and boys. When police entered his Milwaukee apartment, they found human remains throughout, skulls preserved in the closet, photographs documenting his crimes, a human heart stored in the freezer. The initial assumption followed the old framework: sexual deviant. Hunt for evidence of sexual sadism, escalating paraphilic behavior. But investigators who applied the identity assumption framework recognized something different. Dahmer wasn't preserving body parts for sexual gratification. He was trying to prevent abandonment. His case files documented a childhood marked by parental conflict and emotional neglect. When his parents divorced in 1978, court documents show extensive discussion about custody of his younger brother David, but no consideration of what would happen to 18-year-old Jeffrey. He was left completely alone in the family home. No food, no money, no one checking on him. He committed his first murder during that period of total abandonment. Dahmer later explained his motivation in interviews. He was trying to create companions who would never leave him. His attempts at crude lobotomy, drilling into victims' skulls, injecting chemicals, weren't torture for its own sake. They were experiments in creating compliant partners who couldn't abandon him. The preserved body parts weren't trophies. They were possessions he could keep forever. Forensic psychology professor Louis Schlesinger analyzed Dahmer's pattern and noted the distinction. This wasn't sexual sadism. This was desperate attachment pathology, someone trying to possess and control because they couldn't form genuine connection. Understanding this pattern had concrete investigative applications. When investigators recognized Dahmer's motivation was possession rather than sadistic pleasure, they could predict his behavior more accurately. He wasn't likely to escalate into torture because torture wasn't the point. He wasn't likely to taunt police because recognition wasn't the point. He was trying to build a permanent, controllable world of companions, which meant he would continue collecting until stopped. The pattern recognition helped investigators understand why Dahmer had been able to continue for 13 years without detection. He wasn't displaying the ego-driven behavior typical of sexually motivated killers. He was quietly accumulating, like Gein collecting materials in his farmhouse. Dennis Nielsen murdered at least 12 men in London between 1978 and 1983. When police arrested him, after human remains clogged the drains at his apartment building, they found evidence of prolonged preservation behavior. Nielsen had kept bodies in his flat for extended periods. He bathed them, he talked to them. He watched television with corpses propped beside him. Investigators who applied the identity assumption framework recognized the pattern immediately. This wasn't sexual necrophilia. This was profound loneliness seeking resolution through the only companions Nielsen could control. Nielsen later confirmed this analysis in interviews. He described overwhelming isolation, inability to form lasting relationships, desperate need for connection that living people kept denying him. The dead, he explained, couldn't leave. Understanding Nielsen's motivation shaped the interrogation strategy that led to his confession. Investigators approached him not as a sexual predator, but as someone profoundly isolated who had found a terrible solution to loneliness. This approach proved effective. Nielsen confessed extensively, providing details about victims police hadn't yet identified. He wasn't defending his crimes. He was, in a disturbed way, relieved to finally have someone to talk to about them. The pattern recognition, loneliness and possession, not sexual gratification, informed every aspect of how investigators handled the case. Edmund Kemper murdered 10 people between 1964 and 1973, including 6 young women and his own mother. When FBI agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler interviewed Kemper, they encountered one of the most articulate killers in their research, someone who could explain his own psychology with disturbing clarity. Kemper kept his victims' heads. He had conversations with them. He positioned them in his car, in his apartment. The pattern wasn't sexual. It was about control, specifically control over women who represented his mother. Kemper explained his victim selection directly. The college students represented what his mother valued, what she said he could never have. By possessing them, keeping their heads, maintaining imagined relationships, he was exercising control over what his domineering mother had taught him he could never achieve. Forensic psychology professor Louis Schlesinger noted the critical insight. He turned himself in right after he killed his mother because he then solved this problem. He didn't have to kill symbolically anymore. The identity pattern predicted Kemper's trajectory. Investigators who understood that his crimes were about controlling maternal substitutes could anticipate his endpoint. Eventually, he would need to confront the source directly. When Kemper finally murdered his mother, bludgeoning her, decapitating her, screaming at her severed head, the psychological pressure that had driven him to kill surrogates released. He drove to Colorado and turned himself in. Ed Gein's case taught investigators something that transformed criminal profiling. Necrophilia, and the preservation of human remains, isn't always about what it appears to be. When they found Geein's woman suit, they didn't understand what they were seeing. They assumed sexual deviance. The psychiatric evaluation revealed something different. A man trying to literally become his mother because he had never been allowed to become anyone else. That insight, that preserved remains can indicate identity needs rather than sexual needs, changed how investigators read crime scenes, develop suspect profiles, and approach interrogations. The question shifted from, what did this person want to do with the body, to, who is this person trying to become? These 4 patterns, maternal domination, isolation, disorganization, and identity assumption, became the foundation of modern criminal profiling. But their impact goes far beyond just catching killers. In our final section, we'll examine what Ed Gein's case ultimately means, for victims, for investigators, and for understanding how we might prevent the next tragedy before it begins.